Hey everyone, thank you so much for having me today. It is an extreme honor to attend and speak at my very first Creative Commons Global Summit, which also happens to be a wonderful celebration of 2 decades of inspiring a global movement of open knowledge and sharing. My name is Angela Oduor Lungati. You can call me Angie. I am based out of Nairobi, Kenya, and I am a technologist, community builder, and open source software advocate who's passionate about building and using appropriate technology tools to impact the lives of marginalized groups. Over the past decade of my career, I've gained experience in software development, global community management, and nonprofit organizational management. I currently serve as executive director of Ushahidi. This is a global nonprofit technology company that builds integrated tools and services to empower people to generate solutions and mobilize communities for good. Our flagship crowdsourcing product, which is also named Ushahidi, the Ushahidi platform, is used by individuals, NGOs, nonprofits, and enterprises to rapidly gather, analyze, and act on data to strengthen communities and help people thrive. Now, where did it all begin for me? I come from a family with a very heavy engineering background. My mom and my dad are both engineers, so I always knew from a very young age that I wanted to take up an engineering related career. Now, I initially leaned towards electrical engineering, but one day my dad came home with his laptop from work, and that sparked my interest in tech because he would let me occasionally tinker on it. And I guess you could say I got hooked. I suspect that my two girls will catch the bug too, given that my husband and I are also both technologists. Anyway, I then decided to take up computer science and enrolled at Strathmore University here in Nairobi, where I graduated in 2011 with a bachelor's degree in business information technology. Now, as much as I had learned about open source in school and the open movement in general, it was primarily theoretical. And it wasn't until I was exposed to the budding Kenyan tech ecosystem in 2010 that I then got my hands dirty in the open movement. I became a member of the iHub, which is Nairobi's first innovation hub, after its launch in March 2010. That's also where I got to meet the Ushahidi founders and began volunteering with the organization. We could say that this is where my journey in the open source space began. Now, it's generally accepted that contributing to open source provides a unique opportunity for people to learn new skills, which also helps to build their professional reputation. According to an open source survey conducted in 2002, I know that was a very long time ago, 30% of contributors participate to improve their job opportunities, with another 30% directly deriving income from participation. And then you have another 18% deriving direct income, perhaps from visibility on a project that leads to them getting a job. I am a living testament to this fact. 11 years ago, I volunteered with Ushahidi during the 2010 Constitutional Referendum Monitoring Project in Kenya. And today, I am at the organization's helm as executive director, steering us towards making sure that ordinary people continue to have a voice and access technology. Sorry, can you see my screen still? Something happened to my slide deck. Oh, there we go. Anyway, as I was saying, today I'm at the organization's helm, steering us towards making sure that ordinary people continue to have a voice and access technology tools that help them to solve problems in their communities. And I know that my story isn't necessarily a unique one amongst a majority of current and past Ushahidi team members who also joined the team after volunteering and contributing to our work. But I also recognize that my career development and many of the doors that were open to me while working first as a software engineer, then the community manager, and now as executive director has been a direct result of me being a part of the open movement. I've worked at Ushahidi for just over a decade now, and I have witnessed the massive impact that our technology tools and support have had on groups responding to crisis, monitoring elections, documenting human rights abuses, caring for the health of those in their communities, protecting against gender violence, reducing violence, and speaking truth to power. Since its inception in 2008, Ushahidi has grown to be used over 200,000 times in over 160 countries. It's been used to gather over 50 million reports from ordinary people to advance democracy, report incidents, mobilize for crisis response, simplify research, encourage activism, address challenges, influence change, and improve society. And the beautiful thing about it is that Ushahidi is a tool that was built in Africa, a product born out of problems that we always tend to associate with the continent. For example, poor bandwidth, bad governance. We've always imagined Africa as a place that receives technology and innovation, yet here we are exporting it. This kind of exponential growth would not have been possible if we had not been intentional about fostering inclusiveness in building and designing our tools. Ushahidi's goal is to empower communities to thrive as a result of access to data and technology. And this is how we've gone about achieving this goal. One, making the Ushahidi platform open source was a very deliberate effort by the Ushahidi founders to make it accessible to anyone, anywhere in the world, and lower the barriers of use to technology. Second, we choose to meet our beneficiaries where they are by innovating around the tools that they already have access to, the mobile phone. I think the lowest hanging fruit to make sure that anyone could participate in critical conversations was, and likely still is, SMS. Be that my grandmother or my grandfather back in the village, who may not have access to an iPad or a laptop or an internet-enabled phone, they will be able to send in a text message and share their opinion or share their experience and have that lead to something. The beautiful thing about open systems and open source software is that it's generative by nature, because it provides, or that they provide, a framework or a skeleton upon which people can build on top of and adapt to their local context. It allows people to take these tools, make them their own. You're not taking something off of the shelf, you're really taking it and adapting it, and helps them to also use it in ways that they would never imagine without having to start from scratch. For example, focus was mainly on crisis management. Was, the Kenyan election, violence had broken out, and we didn't know what was happening everywhere. So the founders came together and found a way to shed light on what was going on. That was the genesis, us scratching our own itch to try and figure out how to help ordinary people. But over the years, we have seen the tool adapted for various use cases, from election monitoring in Kenya, Zambia, the USA, and many other countries, to tracking cases of sexual harassment in Egypt and India, or something as fun as mapping out the cost of chicken around the world. One of my favorite illustrations of this idea of Ushahidi or open systems being generative comes from, and also one of the most substantial validation of Ushahidi's work stems from our current reality of living with COVID-19. After WHO declared COVID a pandemic, several problems became apparent. There were substantial information gaps, and of course, in a vacuum of credible information, misinformation thrives. And while lockdowns may have been effective in slowing down the spread of the disease, they also had far-reaching social and economic effects on people who had lost their livelihoods. But most of all, we noticed that governments had a limited capacity to respond to a crisis of this magnitude. So local communities sprang into action. And since March of last year, Ushahidi's open source crowdsourcing platform has been deployed over 2,400 times in over 140 countries by grassroots organizations and community actors. These groups were sought to understand the pervasive impact of the disease. They wanted to create visibility into where people could access critical resources and services, fill information gaps for official response, and also hold governments accountable for any shortcomings in responding to the pandemic. One such example is Frena La Curva. By the time Spanish authorities were imposing a lockdown in March of last year, all 50 Spanish provinces had confirmed cases. And I think on March 25th, 2020, their death toll had surpassed mainland China's death toll, coming second to Italy's at over 3,400 people. And so a group of volunteers, entrepreneurs, activists, and social organizations, makers, as well as public and open innovation labs, partnered to provide valuable online resources and map out public services around citizens using the Ushahidi platform to flatten the curve, which is what the word Fana la curva means. The project initially began as a forum for volunteers to collect online resources, curate information and ideas, provide critical resources to the general public. It eventually evolved into a map to connect people who needed help with volunteers, a mutual aid map, essentially. And they managed to collect over 10,000 reports, donated over 28,000 masks to Spanish people. And the amazing thing about them is how they took this tool, developed by a team primarily based in Kenya, customized it to fit what they needed, documented it, and then created a model that they could share with others who wanted to do something similar. So not only did they support people in Spain, but they shared their expertise, supporting the replication of their model in 22 other countries around the world: Portugal, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Chile, Mexico, Uruguay, Bolivia, Argentina, Colombia, France, Peru, Venezuela, Brazil, Guatemala, Germany, and Poland. Talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. And for me, this example shows you how. Now, even as we think about all the good that comes from the open movement, we know that there are several challenges that are also associated with it. And today I will hone in on one that revolves around representation and inclusion. There's been an increased and valid spotlight on diversity and inclusion in the technology space, particularly the prevailing lack of diversity. And sadly, it's no different in the open space. GitHub ran an open source survey in 2017 to gather data on open source software development practices and communities. And they managed to collect responses from over 5,000 randomly sampled respondents, sourced over 3,800 open source repositories on their platform on GitHub. And they got over 500 responses from a non-random sample of communities that work on their platforms. The results highlighted 5 key findings from their research, 3 of which I will delve deeper into in this talk right now. One is the fact that we have considerable gaps in representation in our open source communities. 95 of the respondents to that survey were men, 3% were women, and 1% were non-binary. 1% of the respondents identified themselves as transgender, and about 26% classified themselves as immigrants, while 16% were members of ethnic or national minorities in countries that they lived in. Now, women cited that they were more likely to encounter language that made them feel unwelcome or unwanted, and they were also more likely to experience unwanted sexual advances. Half of the contributors said that their open source work was somewhat critical in getting their current role. So we can see how not working on improving representation in open source might also negatively affect representation in the tech industry in general. Now, the second problem revolves around negative interaction. Franny Zlotnick, who's a data scientist at GitHub, was quoted as saying that open source has a reputation for being aggressive. And we finally collected some hard data on that. Here's a snapshot of what that hard data looked like in 2017. 18% of the respondents had, at the time, personally experienced a negative interaction with another user in the open space, and another 50% had witnessed one between other people. 21% of the people who had experienced or witnessed negative behavior said that they stopped contributing to a project because of that negative interaction. The third finding revolved around documentation, which is one of those easy and quick wins that is often overlooked, but is very key to building inclusive and accessible communities. Nearly a quarter of the open source community reads and writes in English less than very well, yet the majority of documentation still exists in the English language. Now, during my Open Minds podcast interview with Oni, she asked me what better sharing and a brighter future means to me. And my answer still is, increased knowledge and sustained capacity for anyone worldwide to create a better world to live in. And for this to happen, we must invite people and ask them to dance, because what's the point of being at a party just to be seen? We need to foster environments that allow people of different genders, different geographic locations, ideologies, thoughts, different races, different sexual orientations, different skill sets, different religions, different ethnicities, different cultures to coexist and provide everyone with equal opportunity. We could dissect this and talk about this a lot more with more time, but here are a few examples and a few ways that I think we can start. One, establish and enforce your code of conduct. These have been found to be essential in fostering inclusive communities and creating safe spaces for people to exist, collaborate, and engage. Be very loud and proud and make it known what is acceptable and what is not. Second thing is designing models for accessible communication, be it in the tools we use to communicate. We need to make sure that we're also factoring in areas that have low bandwidth. Second, think about the languages that we use. Keep in mind that there are some people who don't use English as a first language. And avoid technical jargon because we also have varying levels of competency and skill sets. Second, or rather, one of the other things we can do is build tools and documentation that in ways that make it easier for people to access and interact with it. Essentially, just meet your people, meet your audiences, your beneficiaries, your contributors, meet them where they are. More often than not, we walk into situations assuming that we know what gaps exist and the solutions to bridge those gaps. My experience over the last decade with Ushahidi has taught me to embrace humility and really lean into the collective intelligence of the people that we seek to serve, because they understand the context and the tensions of the situations much better than anyone else. So our problem-solving strategies have to be user-driven. That means that we'll also have to co-create and co-design solutions rather than introduce a top-down approach. Now, I know that I'm not sure if the results from the 2021 survey on diversity and inclusion in open source by the Linux Foundation are out yet, but I'm also hoping that there's a shift for the better from the GitHub survey that was run in 2017. Strength lies in differences, not in similarities, and especially in the open source space, to help us build better products, to serve all people, and to do good in the world. And that means that each of us needs to put in work to enlighten ourselves, be very conscious of the biases that we may have and ways to mitigate them. We also have to check our privilege and make sure that we're employing it on others' behalf. I think my rallying call here is to be the giant on whose shoulders others can stand, in the same way that the open source world and the open movement has been for each of us individually. Thank you so much for your time and your patience. I am hoping that this has been useful, and I am happy to move on to the question and answer section of today's talk. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. And I hope my feedback isn't as bad as it was earlier, but it's great. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think your story, I just love, your story, the fact that you went along as an activist and now you're running an organization. I mean, I'm just waiting for some question in the chat. I mean, what's been your greatest learning from activist to leader? What have been your challenges and what have you learned?
That's a very, very good question. So we have to recognize that, first of all, when I started off, I was your typical developer who would sit behind the screen and just, focus on the black screen. Yes, I do have a social side of side of me, but moving on to the point where we've gotten to leadership, there's a lot of things that I probably didn't understand as much while I wasn't in a leadership position, that I'm now much more aware of and much more understanding. And I'll give you a classic example. At some point in our journey, we had to figure out a way of keeping the lights on.
Yeah.
And that's a problem that's not unique to Ushahidi. Very many other open source projects out there are struggling with the same problem. And there were certain decisions that I wouldn't have a purview into, and I was very resistant towards them. But now I see that it's not very black and white, right? Yes, you have, I think the learning point there for me is making sure that you have your guiding post and your North Star, which is your mission,
Yeah.
but that even as you're making the decisions, that you're making sure that you're bringing everybody else along with you.
Yes.
That there's an understanding of what drove that decision and what drove those choices. Because in my case, it might have been a case of not having a preview into why it was going on that way, and being stuck in my own little cocoon. And it wasn't until I was in this position that I then figured this is how to do that.
Yeah.
So that would be one of them.
That's a real kind of learning point, but also putting yourself in the other person's shoes and trying
Yes.
to walk with them and understand. And I think that's just so important. And it speaks to also some of the points you've made in your presentation about how do we become, or how are we inclusive? How do we bring people on a journey with us? Because we all need to and want to improve our diversity, because if you said it's not about having people that all say the same things, it's about having different opinions that makes an organization stronger, but doing that in a way that's inclusive and listening and learning. I think it's just, now we've got some questions come in, so I will turn to the questions. Angela, Suzanne's asked, what can participants in the open movement who are not leaders do to increase inclusion and minimize bad behavior? And I think the 2017 GitHub questionnaire and results were very telling. So really interested. Thanks for that, Suzanne, and over to you, Angela, to think about that.
Absolutely. I think it all, again, it starts with my rallying cry at the very end,
yeah,
but it's also very paired up with the code of conduct, right?
Yes.
It's one, don't be afraid to be vocal. So
Yes.
codes of conduct will exist. You can have the guidelines, but if you do not enforce them and embody them in how you carry yourself on a day-to-day basis, then it won't carry much weight. And so my call for individuals would be, if you see something going wrong, speak up, report it. But then I'm also very cognizant of the fact that in some cases, speaking up might put you in an awkward situation. So it might also be a call to people who are running these communities to create those safe spaces that allow for people to feel safe enough to speak up and voice out things that are not happening. And once things are reported, then act on them. If there are bad actors, remove them, because that will also send a message to others that this is not accepted in our community, and so this should not happen again.
Yes, and I think that's right, about action. When something happens, if you're going to have a code of conduct that's functional, you need to act when things are going in the wrong direction, to show that that you're not just talking the talk, but you're walking the walk as well.
The walk.
Yeah, and that's so important. And that speaks to leadership, and it can be leadership of yourself, not just in a leadership position, but how you are going to present. Again, she's checking the chat there, Angela, for more. But I'm curious, how have you? We're talking about community and building community, and you started as an activist, and Ushahidi has grown from strength to strength. I mean, what's your secret sauce? How have you done this, and how are you bringing a new generation into Ushahidi?
Another very good question. You have such good questions.
Thanks, Angela.
What is my secret sauce? I think if I were to think about the Angie that I am today and the Angie at the very beginning of this journey, I think it all stems from my personal values and the need for me to find ways of employing and using my skills to help other people, right? I've done some reflection, and I've had conversations even in my family about knowing the fact that there are some spaces that I could probably go and employ some of my skill sets, but would not feel fulfilled. And I think that Ushahidi and the open space just provided a place to really capitalize on that, because I might be sitting behind my laptop or behind my screen, but whatever little piece of code or whatever little message it is that I'm sharing is going to go a long way in somebody else's life. right? There's one of my team members said after the last year of seeing how people are using the Ushahidi platform for COVID-19, that this is honestly much bigger than us.
Yes.
It's much bigger than us, and you don't might not get to see it on a day-to-day basis because we're really stuck, or rather laser focus on the work that's going on. But yeah, it's long and short answer there is that it starts with a personal value and drive to just make sure that I'm helping people with every little thing that I'm doing. Now, how am I trying to bring in the next generation of leaders into the space? So within the workspace, what we do is we participate in different programs. There's Google Summer of Code, there's the outreachy internships, just as a way to encourage other young and up and coming individuals who want to learn more about the open space, get them to actually jump in and interact with our tools and find ways of then getting into the job market or get into the open source space. So that's one way that I'm doing that, at least from the professional side. And generally, again, because I'm someone who loves to help people, just making myself available, whether it's mentorship or provide advice or insights from my own journey. That's how I think that I'm doing it.
And that those insights are so, you can see in the chat the amount of the words about inspiring and thanking you are just so resonant. Going back to what you're saying about COVID, I see one point I'll go back to, but you talked a bit about COVID and how this has been a moment really in terms of how people have come to the platform. Maybe you could just say a little bit of you. I mean, we've shared different experiences of where we are in the world and what's happening. And I know when I spoke to you a few months back, we were talking about what was happening in Kenya. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what's happening in your world around COVID and some of the things that that you're seeing and presenting to you, and the solutions that Ushahidi has, as you illustrated in Spain, has achieved through that work.
So I think, again, at the very onset, it was primarily focused on people just trying to figure out, what is this monster that is COVID-19? Right. We have no information, and even testing was very limited at the time. So at the onset of the pandemic, it was primarily just, we were getting requests from everywhere around the world, all at the same time. People just wanted to figure out what is it that we can do? How can we help in this situation? And again, it took a life of its own. The people who used to track the general progression of the disease in the communities, there are others who used it to, for mutual aid, connecting people who are high risk with resources or providing visibility on what shops are open and which ones are not. Of course, as time has gone by, obviously, capacity to test has definitely increased a lot. And so that might not necessarily be the main focus, but we're also beginning to see a lot of the side effects beginning to pop up, right? Whether it's the economic and the social effects of the pandemic. So we're also seeing a lot more instances of people deploying the platform for things like human rights protection. I know there's one called Blacklist in Greece that's keeping track of people who are either people losing their jobs as a result of the pandemic, or employers who are taking advantage of that, then make people work extra hours. There was things like the Black Lives Matter protests, the NSAS ones. So there's a lot of that we can see tying into COVID-19 and how that sparked everything else. But of course, now one of the biggest spotlights is on vaccine equity.
Yes.
I'll give you a classic example. So right now, I think a majority of the Western world has populations up to 70 or 80% vaccinated. The reality for us here in Kenya is we probably only have about 2 to 3%. I'm not sure if that's been updated. 2 to 3% of our population fully vaccinated. That in itself is a problem. Yes. I know that the last time you and I talked, I mentioned the fact that vaccine accessibility accessibility to the vaccine was practically none. But over the last 2 months, there's been a lot that's been done with the Gavi Alliance and COVAX. So we've received millions donations from the UK, whether it's Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. And so more and more people are getting access to the vaccine. But this is against the backdrop of the fact that there's been a lot of misinformation and mistrust around the vaccines. People are feeling like whatever is coming in is either substandard. And that's further complicated by the fact that as the rest of the world is beginning to move on, there's almost this tag of the dark continent in a way, because there are now such strict measures, even when it comes to travel. One classic example is recently the UK decided that there's only a specific list of countries from where they recognize full vaccination. If you're coming from Kenya, despite the fact that you're fully vaccinated, vaccine that is donated by the UK, you will be considered unvaccinated and will have to quarantine for 14 days. So within the context of Ushahidi, one of the things that we've also been thinking about is how we can then capitalize or leverage the tool to help shed light on what are people's perceptions about the vaccine. One. Two, also shed light into positive stories, because we also know that the key to behavioral change might lie in that. If I see somebody else went in and got it, then I'll probably be inspired to go ahead and do that. And three, also figure out how to support governments, whether it's on the distribution side. And so that's the current space that we're sitting in. Yes, there's still more work going on shedding light on the effects of the pandemic, but then we also really want to hone in on how can we support on vaccine rollout efforts within the African continent, and also shed light, keeping in mind that we also want to surface what the citizens are feeling, but just working around that space.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it'll be good to hear how the vaccine rollout, what you see and what's the learning. And there's a couple of questions that have come in the chat, and so one's from Oni, and Oni's question is, as Ushahidi continues to grow, what other ways would you like to see your technology used and adapted by others? And are there any hopes, plans to expand into new regions and geographies that Ushahidi isn't already working in? So that's the first question. There's a couple of questions there. Molly's got a question. I'd love to hear about Angela's inspiration for aspirations for the future of Creative Commons in light of her new leadership role and coming onto the board of Creative Commons. So we'll take Oni's question first about, as you continue to grow, would you like to see your technology used and adapted by others? What does that look like? And then the plans of expansion.
Okay, absolutely. So to answer the first part, so again, when I think about how Ushahidi is used, I think for me at the end of the day, I want to see it being used in appropriate ways. And what that means, if there are cases where it seems like Ushahidi isn't the best solution, then that's also okay. There's one particular space that I'd like to see more of, but we're also in a space of thinking about how best we can help. And that again would be something that would be largely driven by stakeholders in the space, and that would be climate change. We have a couple of ideas, but it has to be driven by stakeholders in the space, and we're always seeking partnerships to figure out how to do that. But I think right now our major focus is making sure that the tool as is actually meets the needs of our users. Right? We recognize that we are in, we're in an ever-changing technology landscape. COVID-19 has come in and literally pulled the rug from under our feet. And so we're also taking a step back to listen and engage with our users and understand. So what does this shift mean for you? And what more do we need to do to serve you better? So a lot of the conversations that you will have with many of our team members right now will really revolve around what do we need to do to make sure the tool is reaching the people that we need them to reach. In as far as expanding into new regions or geographies that Ushahidi is working in, absolutely. And that will be very closely tied to the work that we do in terms of adaptation of the product. So we keep, we'll keep, working on our strategy and really thinking about that. Now, moving on to Molly's question. So I had this sentence in my presentation. I don't know why I didn't say it, but yes, I'm really excited and really honored to have been invited to join the board of Creative Commons. And I think for me, I'm really excited about being able to bring in a different a lens based on my experience over the last decade, especially working with marginalized communities and trying to figure out the best way of being able to serve them. It all goes back to the tagline that we have, better sharing, brighter future. I'm really excited to dig in and get to see what exactly that will mean. I know that the Creative Commons community is, very diverse and very far and wide. I want to see if there's something that I can also do to help that become much more entrenched, especially within the African continent. Yeah. So stay tuned.
We are super excited, Angela, and we are so it's just wonderful that you're going to be in a more regular basis as part of our community in terms of being on the board, and that is just wonderful.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, we are just we're just delighted. You mentioned climate change. Maybe I could ask a little bit more about what your thoughts are about the platform and the climate emergency, and what's presenting itself to you at the moment. As I've said to a number of speakers, we're coming up the big climate change conference in a few weeks' time, and we're all thinking a little bit more about, and much more about true sustainability and what that looks like. I'm curious to know what's presenting itself to you.
So in terms of places that we see we can add value, I think one of the things that this might also just be my own personal perception about this, is that there's a lot of conversation happening about climate change in the West, but there's not so much of it that's happening over within in the African continent. And I'm also not sure that there's a lot more awareness happening, especially with ordinary people, and that's something that probably applies globally. So one of the first ways that we were thinking about it is shedding more light into some of the unusual suspect areas, right? And of course, it's closely tied to the fact that we do a lot of our work is around crisis response, and many of the crises that we are seeing in our world today are sparked by natural disasters as a result of climate change. So that's one. But then I think the next thing that we also the thing that we still need to figure out is figuring how to move from just creating awareness about it, but into building resilience. And that's where I would like to spend more of my time with people, just having conversations and figuring out what is it that we need to do? What is it that we need to do, whether it's as an open movement in general, or as Ushahidi, or as technologists, that could help us begin to solve this problem and build resilience within our communities to tackle climate change.
Angela, can you hear me now? No. No, I don't think Angela can hear me, everyone, but you
can you all hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me, Angela? Angela, we can hear you. Alas, we cannot hear you.
Yes, Catherine, I can't hear you.
Oh no, that's brilliant. So we figured this out.
That is so weird. Okay, Catherine, I will watch the chat for any questions you have for me.
So I'm just looking about any other questions coming through. Everyone's laughing out loud. This is quite difficult to kind of think about questions when I can't talk, which is making me think a wee bit more. So I think that another question I think we had was about the future of open source, and there was one question.
I see a question on the future of open source.
Yeah. And there was another one about the behavioural issues. So let's put that down. Sorry, everyone's waiting. I can't spell today. It's just, I think it's because I was up till 3:30. Yeah. What is the future of open source? We'll maybe have a couple and then we'll just try and kind of conclude in a minute or two.
Aha. Yeah. Okay. So I'm guessing that the question is what the future of open source is,
yes,
and how we can behave more inclusively.
That's it.
So I know that there's a lot of work being done thinking about last mile connectivity, especially in the global south.
Yeah.
And I also know that there's much more interaction and rather participation of people within the African continent in the open source space. So I honestly think that the future lies in connecting the last billion, because the more we see more of these groups that are traditionally not considered to be either literate, etc., participating, then the more we'll also begin to see more diverse solutions coming up, and us actually getting to build a better world. In terms of us behaving more inclusively, I think it all just boils down to the same points that I'd shared before. So one, just making sure that we're being very open and welcoming to people of diverse skill sets. Two, thinking about the channels within which we communicate with people, factor in areas of low connectivity, low bandwidth, begin to also host, be very intentional about hosting events in some of the areas that we want to expand into. One of the beautiful things that I've loved about the summit is that it's been at an almost optimal time zone, because you've been able to capture people from different parts of the world, and you've been able to accommodate that. So maybe we should thank COVID for the fact that it's allowed for a virtual space that allows people to join in from wherever they are at whatever time, as opposed to having to be online at very odd hours of the evening. Yeah, so those would be my answers.
Thanks. Now we've had one other thing: alert systems based on destructive actions around nature. About and I'm going to put something in the chat, Angela, just a sec.
Is that a question from Subodh?
I think it is. Yeah.
So I'm seeing a question here. Okay. All right. So alert. I'm just going to read through. Okay. So there's one question here by Subodh above, where he asked that it's a general assumption that people contributing to open source are probably generous, open-minded, or selfless ones, but the GitHub study shows lots of negativity and discouraging behavior. What could be the reasons for this? Any analysis from the psychological point of view? So caveat, I am no psychologist in any way, but I would think that it probably stems more from a lack of awareness about the differences that each of us have. I think the expectation that people will be coming in with is that the way I conduct things is the way somebody else should do them. And when they then encounter cases where that's not the case, then there's a very abrasive and explosive reaction around that. So I think it all kind of boils down to being more understanding of our differences, and also being more aware of them. I think that's probably where it all begins. All right. Let me look at the next question. Bjorn also has a question. How can we make sure that a new generation can actually take part in the free movement given the obstacles, closed devices, and surveillances? So I think it all begins with equipping them. I know that I've said this in a bunch of my talks. I know that there's a lot of policy trying to tackle some of these things, whether it's surveillance or bad actors, etc. But there is an overwhelming sense that people aren't quite aware of some of the risks that might be associated. And so getting people to have a very clear understanding of this is what it takes, that the risks associated, and also empowering them to figure out how to then shield themselves would be good. And that might mean working more closely with more partnerships actually. So partnering with groups that do trainings or awareness creation around digital security, etc. I think that would probably be my take on that one. And then Catherine had a question on Ushahidi's key phrase is raise your voice. How do we raise our voices? I'm going to ask a question right back. Raise your voice in what context?
I'll maybe come in here. I was thinking about how you're advocating and how you are going about that. So I'll put this in the chat, Angela. Yeah, raise your voice in what context, Catherine? Generally, yes, generally.
This is very interesting. Like I can see Catherine's screen, but I can't hear her.
Okay, no, I've got it.
Aha. So how do we raise our voice generally? It starts with, well, I was initially inclined to say don't be afraid, but then I think it's important to pay homage to that feeling that pops up, but then embrace it, but then find a way of putting it away, and then moving forward. So it's being courageous enough to be aware that I'm afraid of this, but then still go ahead and speak out. It means be more vocal, share your opinions a lot more. Don't be afraid. No, you can be afraid, but be open to being challenged from time to time. So I think that would be my take there. Be open to participating more and sharing your voice or sharing your opinions more, especially in places where you feel most afraid to occupy those spaces, because you are there because you belong there. I'm sorry, folks. This is very jarring. I'm really trying to keep track of the text on the side and what Catherine is saying.
I know. I'm sorry. I think I will give you the last word, Angela.
Oh, thank you so much, Catherine, and thanks again for everyone. Thanks so much for having me on today's conversation. I'm really looking forward to diving into the Creative Commons community more, especially in my new role as a board member. So let's definitely keep in touch. Thank you so much.